Hi there, this is Liz Pierce. I'm at Lynn Benton Community College and I'm recording this talk for my students in HDFS 201, Contemporary Families in the United States. This screencast is going to contain some of my thoughts about how we study families and society in this class. 2 short video clips, about 7 minutes, of which you'll pause the screencast and watch those, and then the implicit bias test from Harvard, which you will also take as a part of the class. So the first thing I want to talk about is how we study families and how we as individuals study families. And we have to acknowledge as sociologists that we are human beings. And part of being human is understanding your own perspective, which is partly knowing what your own bias is. So when we talk about being objective or subjective, in reality, human beings can only be subjective. Part of what makes us a human being are all the unique experiences and thoughts that each one of us has. But when we're studying sociology, we're going to try to be as objective as possible, as clinical, as scientific as we can possibly be. So that's where we also think about critical thinking and examining evidence and separating that from our own bias or our own perspective. Having bias doesn't mean you're bad. Again, it just means you're human. So let me give you an example from my own life so you can know what I mean. So in my case, I'm a divorced woman, and I had my children before I got divorced. And as you know, the research about divorce is quite conflicting. That there is research that shows that children tend to have long-term good outcomes. Children of divorce tend to have long-term outcomes that are good as compared to children in intact families. There's also research that shows us that some children are more inclined, especially to have short-term negative impacts from divorce. Now, there's no way that I can read a research article about divorce or talk about divorce without also being aware of my own experience. That's always there for me, and it's always important to me to think that I've done the very best job I can do as a parent for my children. So when we talk about knowing your own perspective or knowing your bias, that's one of mine. I have to be aware of that when I study and talk about divorce, because who I am and my experiences are going to influence the way I think about it. The other thing I want to talk about is research methods. There basically are 2 basic methods. One is surveys, so that's like where you take a survey, just like you take at Lynn Benton. You take surveys, for example, evaluating your classes or other experiences here. So self-reporting surveys. And then there are observational studies. And these are the 2 main methods that are used to study families. Either getting people to self-report about their activities and their families, or to observe them long-term, in-depth, in their natural environments. Now, of course, there's a reason we don't do lab experiments on people, right? Because it just isn't practical or humane to think that we would study people, divide them up randomly, and give one group one experience and another group another experience. For example, would you think it was fair if we were going to do a study on online students at Lynn Benton Community College and said that half of you would get electricity and half of you would not? Obviously, that would have an impact on your education, depending on which group you were assigned to. So we don't tend to do lab experiments on people and families. We tend to do these kinds of surveys or observational studies. So in this class, what we're going to be studying is how individuals and families live, their activities, interactions, their processes, their organizations within the context of the much larger, greater society. And that's always going to be a bi-directional study. In other words, we're going to look at how social processes and institutions affect families and how family affects social processes and institutions. The photographs I have here are to indicate the landmark Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, that finally said that states could not make interracial marriage illegal. So I chose that example because we might think that, oh, this law changed and that impacted families. Well, that's true. That's an example of a social institution impacting a family. But at the same time, families and people impacted the social institution so that it could change. I have an image here of the civil rights movement and then of the couple that actually brought the case, Loving versus Virginia. And obviously in two different ways, families impacted society. And again, as a student and a sociologist in this class, we acknowledge our own bias and our own humanity. Here's just a list of social categories, and you want to think about these categories. You've already read an article about the social construction of difference and how it is that in some categories we assign a great deal of value to the difference between people. And again, that's a social construction, not a biological construction. I'd like you to understand the term implicit bias, and there are a couple ways you can do that. One is to go to this crash course, the Vlog Brothers, who I just love, my daughter introduced me to. The first 2 minutes of this video really talk about implicit bias. They also get into conversations about prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping that are also useful. And if you haven't had an experience with that before, I would recommend listening to the whole thing. But definitely listen to the first 2 minutes. Watch the first 2 minutes. The other thing you're going to do is go ahead and take a test with Project Implicit at Harvard University. Again, you can just click on the link here. This is a really fascinating thing to do. I'd like you to take at least 2 of these. You could do more if you want. I think there are about a dozen. You don't have to log in to take the test. You can if you want to get results, but you don't have to log in. Each test only takes a couple of minutes, 2, 3, 4 minutes, I think. And if you want more explanation about what it is before you do it, there are directions on the website. And then also that same video you just watched with the Vlog Brothers, at about 4:41, he actually describes the implicit bias test so that you can use that to assess yourself. This will be something that will play into some later assignments that we're doing in this class. So you'll want to do this and kind of record your reactions and responses. The second video I want you to watch is this one, What Does My Headscarf Mean to You? So if you would pause the screencast now, watch this video, and then come back, and I have a couple questions and sort of examples to give you. So basically, when you watch this video, I'm wondering how many of you felt surprised when you learned that she was a race car driver. I definitely did. And that's just a really great example of implicit bias. It just shows that somewhere in our unconscious, we have constructed an image or a belief about a woman who looks like this that would probably not be a race car driver. And it's just your unconscious telling you that. Of course, many of us would say, oh, it's fine for this woman to be a race car driver. If we said we think she shouldn't be because she's Muslim or because she's a woman, that would be prejudice. But the just merely being surprised, that's just an example of the implicit bias. So going down the continuum, prejudice would be if you said she shouldn't or couldn't because of her religion or because of her appearance or because of her being a woman. Discrimination would be if you actually created behaviors or limitations that were imposed on her that would not allow her to be a race car driver. So in this course, we're really talking a lot about how implicit bias unintentionally leads to discrimination. And that's how we want to think about understanding implicit bias. So in terms of theories and perspectives, which we're looking at also as being a sociologist in this class, we're using theories to study families. And theories are a formal hypothesis that explores the relationship between two or more variables. So it's not quite the same as if when you're sitting at a coffee shop and you say, well, I have a theory about that. It's more these academic theories that have been put out there. There's some data, there's some evidence that supports the hypothesis, and that there's been some research done to support it. And you'll notice as we study these theories that they can kind of overlap and intersect with each other and sometimes contradict each other. And sometimes that can feel a little confusing. Often theorists use one theory or framework for their main ideas and then also acknowledge other theorists. So you don't have to believe or agree with or demonstrate that you understand every theory in this course, but you are going to be showing that you understand at least some of the theories in this course. Again, the research methods could be things like surveys or studies that support the theories. Some are just a snapshot, kind of a quick look of how things are at a certain time in place. Other surveys and studies go long term and study families and peoples over time. So you want to pay attention to those different kinds of theories. In closing, I want to say that as we progress through the course, that I want you to understand what implicit bias is. I want you to start to be aware of your own bias and to be a critical thinker in that way, being aware of your own bias and also willing to examine the evidence. As always, feel free to post questions in the class forum and discuss what you've heard and learned on this screencast and to raise those questions. That's all for today.